أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Today we're going to continue our discussion with starting off with check-ins. So how are you guys doing? And how was your weekend? How did you grow during the weekend? What obstacles did you encounter? Were there moments in time where you did not grow? How are you documenting, as in journals or something that you're recording all this stuff in? How are you documenting your growth or your struggles or your challenges and your solutions that you're coming up with? What are you looking forward to for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week? And how are you planning actively for it, or are you just letting it happen? And then, as you're doing everything, how are you pausing to reflect on what emotions you're feeling or what perceptions are coming into play when you're making particular decisions? And how are you learning as you go from this perspective throughout your life? So here's a scenario for you to think about. So someone reaches out to you and they mention that their wife is giving them a hard time. He also notes that his family, her family, is pretty much implanting negative thoughts in her mind. Okay, and this is making things difficult for her. And she's giving a hard time. She's giving him a hard time as a consequence of this. And he has been trying to be there for her in every way possible and stuff. He's been helping her around the house. He's been helping her and do, whatever it is that she needs help with and stuff. He is doing whatever it takes and stuff. And he's also working, and he's also trying to do other things and stuff. So it's like very overwhelming for him, but he's not complaining, and he's actually enjoying this because he likes to take care of his wife. And at the same time, his family is also being really nice to him, to her, and they're trying to look out for her and stuff, and they're like doing whatever they can to help, right? And they're supporting her in every way that they can help it. So this is what the husband is telling you, and then you decide, okay, you got something. So let's go ahead and check with the wife. In this case, let's say, let's assume that both sides had reached out to you, or one of them had reached out to you, and anyways, you were able to, or you were allowed to, speak to the other side and so on, right? So you reach the other side and you try to get her side of the picture. So she mentions that it's not a good life and stuff, and she mentions that her in-laws and her husband are rude, and they insult her, and they demean her, and she's just overwhelmed, and she just cannot take this anymore, and that they're trying to, or her husband is trying to cut her off from her family, and her family means a lot to her and stuff, and she is just not wanting to be with him because he is manipulative. And he also mentions that from her side, her family is manipulative as well. And so this is what's the situation. And so this is the initial sort of discussion with both of them. Not discussion, but just hearing, like a listening session essentially. So what is going on, and what do you do? What are your next steps? So as you have this in your mind, as you're reflecting on this, I'm gonna actually pause for a second so you guys can internalize this before we move on, and we'll come back to it later, inshallah. Alright, so we will move on, and we will come back to this later on, inshallah. Remember, your focus is try to figure out what's happening underneath all of this presentation, and you have to figure out how to move forward from here. Now, it's a little bit of a tricky situation because you might have to employ a certain strategy, and you might have to navigate this in a very particular way. So let's go from there to discuss something different. So there's this blank that your brain is going to try to fill in, this blank, and we're going to go from there, inshallah. So maybe you'll find something in the discussion or the movement in the other slides that might answer the question. Maybe not. Maybe you're going to be making connections to previous information, and our brains need that connection to previous information to move forward. So with that, let us continue. We're just glancing over these as some things to keep in mind, but also to think about for future studies and so on. Okay. Now, just like before, we are going to get into an intellectual stimulation. So, pick one, or two, or three, whichever one.
Bottom one.
Bottom one. Okay, good.
Yep.
So this one in particular is a standalone one, and it's good that you picked this one. Again, I'm gonna speed it up. I have you can see the links obviously in the slides. You can always go there, inshallah, and watch it for for yourself. But I want this information just to kind of prime you, so I don't need you to really analyze everything that they're saying. I just want you to just take it and get exposed to the information and start thinking along those lines. That's it. Now I'm probably gonna have to make some comments, either throughout or maybe at the end, but we'll discuss that as that comes along, inshallah. So just watch it, just kind of pay attention to the overall general concept, the underlying thing that he's trying to convey, and we will go from there. Now the title of this is How Mindfulness Changes the Emotional Life of Our Brains. Yes, this does connect to the question that I asked at the very beginning in the check-ins. And it also does connect to the scenario question that I had mentioned. And so all these things are necessary to connect, are necessary. And they are also connected to the other videos that are out there.
I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training. When I first began my career, I began with a question. Why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's slings and arrows and others more resilient? And that question is still central to all the work that we do. And we are particularly interested in how we can nudge people along this continuum to nourish and nurture the qualities that promote human flourishing. In the early part of my career, I focused almost exclusively on the negative side of the equation, on adversity, on the brain circuits that were important for understanding why some people are more vulnerable to stress, why others may be more likely to develop a depression or anxiety. And then something very significant happened in my life. In 1992, I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And this picture of His Holiness was taken in Madison, Wisconsin, and he visited us several times. And he was the chief inspiration in our turning toward the positive. And in that critical moment in 1992, he challenged me, and he said, why can't you use the same tools of modern neuroscience to study kindness and to study compassion in addition to studying anxiety and fear and depression and stress? And I didn't have a very good answer for him on that day, other than that it's hard. But when we first began to study kindness, when we first began to study anxiety and depression, that was hard too, and we've made some progress in that area. So the work that we and others have been doing is predicated on a critical insight in modern science, the insight concerning neuroplasticity. Our brains are constantly changing, constantly being shaped by the forces around us. We have typically very little awareness of what those forces are. Our brains are changing wittingly or unwittingly. Most of the time it's unwittingly. Most of the time we're not aware, and we also have little control over those forces. And the invitation in the work that I'm sharing with you today is that we can actually take more responsibility for our own brains by transforming our minds. But first, let me share with you what some of the consequences of having our brains being shaped unwittingly are. And I'd like to focus on 4 challenges that have been critical in our society today. And these challenges are failures of well-being in important ways. The first is distractibility. Research indicates that if we take people out and about in the world and we text them, and this has been done in a study that was published a number of years ago, very influential study with several thousand people, we text them and we ask them 3 questions. The first question is, what are you doing right now? And they check off from a list of activities. Second question, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question is, at this very moment, how happy or unhappy are you? Here's what was found. The average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what we're doing. Folks, we can do better. And when they were not paying attention to what they're doing, they were significantly less happy. The scientific paper upon which this is based was titled, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." In addition, There is a huge increase in the incidence of attention deficit disorders in children in this country. This is a graph showing a trend over the last decade. There are many reasons for this increase, but some of them have to do with a genuine increase in distractibility. If we're all honest with ourselves, our nation is suffering not simply from a fiscal deficit, but from an attention deficit. We also are suffering from loneliness. Despite the fact that we're all so much more interconnected, 76% of middle-aged Americans report that they have moderate to high levels of loneliness. And this loneliness is not an ephemeral, subjective state. It also impacts our bodies, our physical health. Recent research shows that loneliness is actually a more significant predictor by more than a twofold magnitude of early mortality compared to obesity. So this exacts real tolls on our brains and our bodies. And again, research shows we can do better. Negative self-talk and depression, we all have a narrative in our mind that we carry around about who we are. And sometimes we have negative beliefs about ourselves, which can culminate in depression. And this turns out to be a very serious problem. Depression is on the rise. If you look at trends just over the last few years, what you see is a very large increase, particularly among women. Over the 3 years alone, there's been a 33% increase in diagnoses of major depression in women. And this trend is occurring in teens as well. These are disturbing trends in kids ages 12 through 17, and the gender difference also is very, unfortunately, robust, where the incidence is much greater in females, and this trend is getting worse over time. And again, the evidence suggests that we can actually train our mind and harness the power of neuroplasticity to change these qualities in our mind. Suicide rates are very disturbing. During the Great Depression, there was a huge elevation, and those rates have come back down. And then since the year 2000, there's been, unfortunately, a steep rise in suicide rates. And again, this is not something restricted to adults. Our teens are showing more than doubling over the last 10 years in suicides. So that today in the United States, unfortunately, more than one teenager every single day is taking her or his own life. There also is a pervasive loss of meaning and purpose that people are reporting. And this loss is not simply, again, a subjective quality, but also exacts a toll on our health and other aspects of our well-being. Research shows that a lack of purpose predicts an early death. In a recent study, people who were in their 60s with a low sense of purpose had more than twice the likelihood of dying within 5 years compared to people who reported a high sense of purpose. So again, there are intimate connections between our psychological well-being and our systemic health. Challenges affects the mind and the brain. We're not thriving, but the invitation is that we really could be. So we've developed a framework for understanding a healthy mind. And this framework includes 4 pillars. The first pillar is awareness. And awareness includes the capacity to focus our attention, to resist distraction. It also includes a quality that psychologists and neuroscientists call meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is knowing what our minds are doing. How many of you have ever had the experience of reading a book where you're reading each word on a page, and you read one page, you may read the second page, and after a few minutes you have absolutely no idea what you just read? That is an example of a lapse in meta-awareness. But the moment we recognize that we've been lost and come back, that is a moment of meta-awareness. And we have reason to believe that meta-awareness is crucial. Actually, it's necessary, we believe, for real transformation to occur. The second pillar of a healthy mind is connection. Connection refers to those qualities which nurture harmonious interpersonal relationships. Qualities like appreciation, like kindness, like compassion, having a positive outlook. And again, the research shows that it doesn't take much to start activating these latent qualities which can flourish and become stronger. The third pillar of a healthy mind is insight. And insight is about insight into the narrative that we all have about ourselves. At the very extreme end of the continuum, there are people who have a very negative narrative. They have negative self-beliefs, and they hold those beliefs to be a true description of who they are. That is a prescription for depression. And a healthy mind entails changing our relationship to this narrative. Not so much changing the narrative itself, but changing our relationship to it, so that we can look at the narrative and see it for what it is. What is this narrative? It's a constellation of thoughts. And when we can see it as that, we can foster more room, more breathing room, and this leads to increased well-being. Finally, the last pillar of a healthy mind is purpose. And here, we're talking about having a sense that our life is headed in a particular direction. And most importantly, it is about taking more and more of the activities in our lives as belonging to the sense of purpose. Can you envision living your life so that taking out the garbage and doing the laundry is still related to your sense of purpose? Being able to broaden it in this way is a very crucial ingredient of a healthy mind. Have you ever trained your mind? Research from neuroscience leads us to understand that there are 2 fundamentally different kinds of learning. One form of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about things. I can learn the value of kindness by sitting down and studying texts about kindness, but this won't necessarily lead us to become kinder. We can teach people the value of honesty, but this will not necessarily make them an honest person. In order to cultivate these qualities, we need a second form of learning, and that is called procedural learning. Neuroscience teaches us that these kinds of learning operate through totally different brain circuits. We need both to produce real transformation. The wiring in our brains is not fixed, it's adaptable, and we can harness the power of neuroplasticity to change our brain. Let me give you one example. This is an example from research that we did where we randomized people to a group that received compassion training for 2 weeks, another group that received training from cognitive therapy. We put people in the MRI scanner before and after the 2 weeks of training, and lo and behold, we see systematic differences after just 7 hours of practice. Our brains can change in a remarkably rapid period of time. The changes that are displayed here are changes in the circuit that involve the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, a circuit very important for certain kinds of positive emotions, which gets strengthened after just this short amount of practice. So these and other kinds of data indicate that the brain really can change quite quickly. It doesn't mean that these changes will last, but it means that they can occur, they can begin, and with systematic practice, they will endure. We view this as an urgent public health need. So we need to start someplace. I would recommend 3 minutes a day. When human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And yet, today, we all do. This is not part of our genome. This is a learned behavior. And it doesn't take much to start these mechanisms in the brain to change. So we can do this when we're doing other things. We can do this while we're commuting. We can do this as we're literally brushing our teeth. We can do this as we're having our first cup of coffee or tea in the morning. We can do this as we're walking. This can be incorporated in routines of our daily life. So we can nourish our mind, and through it, we can change the world. We can reduce implicit bias that gets. And this is something that we've shown can occur with strengthening connection. We can increase school achievement, and we and others have shown this with training and awareness. We can reduce healthcare costs potentially by cultivating well-being, as the connections that I've illustrated show. We can cultivate a strong sense of purpose, we can reduce distraction, and we can increase productivity and focus. And I'd like to end with just a 1-minute short period of practice to give you an experiential taste of this. So if you all just sit for a moment, put down your pens and devices, and I invite you to bring a loved one into your mind and your heart. You can leave your eyes open or closed. And for those who are viewing this online, please share this 1 minute with us. And as you bring this loved one into your mind and your heart, cultivate the strong aspiration that they be happy and be free of suffering. And they share the same wish for happiness and the same wish to be free of suffering as all human beings. And you can envision a time in their life when they may have been having some difficulty. And you can say a simple phrase in your mind: may you be happy, may you be free of suffering. And simply notice whatever may come up for you. And then we can do this for many categories of people, including a difficult person. So I invite you to join us on this journey, and the very future of humanity, we think, depends on it. Thank you very much.
Next one.
Can you do the one on the right? Yep.
Give me just 1 second.
Okay, so life is worth living and the glass is half full. When Bertolt Brecht said, the man who is laughing has not yet heard the bad news. Hi, Nick. Nicholas Carr. Thank you, Moses. Thank all of you very much. Let me start by asking how many of you
Give me 1 second.
have a smartphone either on your person or near your person right now? It's pretty much unanimous. Well, my goal is by the end of my talk, when you go out for your lunch break, I want you all to go out following the example of network. I'll go out onto the sidewalk and smash your smartphones.
Now, this is the title, what the internet is doing to our brains. So that's where it's coming from. And he actually has a book on this. If you get a chance, look at it. That would be something to look through. Something interesting to look through.
But that might be setting the bar too high. So at least think about smashing your smartphones. We humans crave information. We crave it the way we crave sex, way down deep in our synapses, deep in our neurons. There have been studies that show that whenever we find a new piece of information, or even when we go out and seek a new piece of information, a little bit of dopamine is released in our brain. And as you probably know, dopamine is a pleasure-producing chemical, neurotransmitter, very, very important to brain function, but also implicated in pretty much all kinds of addictions. What dopamine basically does is encourages you to do something over and over again by making it pleasing. So we have what seems to be a very deep instinct to seek out and gather as much information as quickly as possible.
Okay. Now, as you're listening to this, I want you to make a connection to the talk that we had. The questions in the very beginning, the checking questions, and also the challenge activity, but also the previous video that we just watched. So try to make those connections now. See like what the other guy was talking about, and how this aspect, the internet aspect, could be internet meaning also social media and things like that. How that the information age related stuff, right? How that can impact you, as well as have had an impact in the situation that we mentioned, the challenge activity, and is also having in terms of your daily living and so on, and including mindfulness and things like that he was talking about, mindfulness, purpose, and so on. So keep those in mind.
And when you think about it, I think it becomes clear pretty quickly why this evolved in our brains, why this instinct. I mean, when you think about what it must have been like in hunter-gatherer times, or earlier than that even, being able to find new information, to know everything that was going on around you, probably increased substantially of your survival. You wanted to see that tiger before it jumped on you, or you wanted to see that little berry bush so you could have dinner for the evening and stay alive. So we have, deep in our biology, this desire to know everything that's going on around us. And that's amplified by another very basic instinct, our social instinct. We get rewards when we know what other people are thinking about us, what conversation is going on around us. Even just having more information than other people makes us socially attractive. Are you
And then we have these commercials. So
tired of seeing these cell phone towers everywhere? Would you like them to go away?
Attractive raises our social status. So we have these very deep instincts to go out and gather as much information as possible. And for most of human history, that was fine. In fact, the reason they call them survival instincts is they add to our odds of survival. But think about what we've done in recent years. We've created, essentially, this new environment in which we live, more and more a digital environment that we enter through our smartphones, that we enter through our computers, our tablets, that's all wrapped up with social media and the internet. We've created an environment of unlimited information. And then we've geared that environment to push information to us all the time through our phones and other devices, from Google or from Facebook or from Twitter or whatever. So we have this instinct, this very primitive instinct to want to know everything that's going on around us. And then we've created an environment in which there's no end to new information that's out there. And what we begin to see very, very quickly is this, compulsive kind of behavior. And my guess is, since most of you walk around with cell phones or smartphones all the time, you've probably seen that kind of compulsive behavior in yourselves. Pulling out your phone, even when nothing's going on and there's not even any particular reason to do it, you'll pull it out just to see, who knows, maybe there's something going on. And certainly if there's any indication that you've got a new message or a new notification, well, you'll pull out your phone. And for a lot of people, the last thing they do before they go to bed, check your phone or your computer. First thing they do when they get up, check your phone or computer. And if you have a bad night's sleep and wake up at 2 in the morning, well, you might as well check it then too, because something interesting could have happened. And when you look at the science of our behavior, you see all sorts of evidence that, in fact, this is taking place. There have been studies of how long people spend on looking at individual web pages when they're browsing the web or Googling stuff, looking for information. It's about 10 seconds. And that includes the time it takes for the page to load. And what's very interesting in that research is it doesn't matter how much information or even how good the information is on the web page. The researchers in one study, they added a lot of text or added a lot of images. The time people stayed on the individual page stayed at about 10 seconds. So clearly what you want to do is grab the gist of what's on the page, then find a link and click and go somewhere else so you can get some new information. There was an interesting study of what happens when people have computers in front of them at work. This was a few years ago. Researchers went out, they want to find out how often people glance at their email inbox. First they asked people, how often do you glance at your email inbox? People said, 2 or 3 times an hour. Then they put these eye tracking goggles on them that actually tracked where their focus was. And they found that people glanced at their email inbox 20 to 30 times an hour, 10 times more than they were even conscious of. So every couple of minutes. If you look at studies of teenagers in their phones, in texting, you find that the average teenager sends or receives about 3,300 texts a month these days. For teenage girls, it's actually over 4,000 texts a month. And that breaks down to one text about every 6 minutes throughout your entire waking life. And if you think adults show any more restraint around their gadgets, well, forget it, because the latest studies of how often an adult will pull out his or her smartphone and look at it during the course of the day, it's about 160 times, which works out to about once every 6 minutes during your waking life. And as we know from that email study, that's almost surely an understatement, because people consult their phones, consult the internet, consult social media all the time without even consciously realizing they're doing it. Well, this kind of behavior is very good for internet companies. If you're Google or Twitter or Facebook, you want people to constantly be checking their phone, constantly go online. You don't want people to stay put at any place for very long. And the reason for that is that these companies, and almost all internet companies, make more money the more quickly we jump from bit of information to bit of information. That's when they gather more information about us. And that's also when they gain new opportunities to show us the advertisements that ultimately fund their businesses. So this is very good for internet.
Did you notice the ads that came up? So he's referring to that because these kinds of things help people make money. So that's what he's referring to over here.
Companies. But what about for ourselves and the way we think and the way we use our minds? You might say, well, we're just adapting to a new technology. We've had new technologies, new information technologies, new media technologies for hundreds of years now. Every time one comes along, we adapt our way of thinking to suit the technology. And so we're becoming, maybe it's good to be scatterbrained. Maybe it's good to be distracted all the time and interrupted all the time. And we're optimizing our mind to live in this new environment. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think we are very good at adapting. We have flexible, malleable minds. But we need to look at the downsides. Because even if we adapt, that doesn't mean that we end up better people or better thinkers after that process.
So here, I'm going to pause this. I'm going to make some comments here. So just because we're adapting doesn't necessarily actually mean that we are getting better. So there's different kinds of adaptations.
And if we look at what the internet and all this technology is actually doing to the way we think, the picture gets much, much darker. And it all has to do with how our brains transform information, mere information, into knowledge, giving us the ability to think deeply, to think rich thoughts, to think conceptually and critically. And the way this happens really has a lot to do with 2 forms of memory. On the one hand, you have what's called your working memory, and that's basically the contents of your conscious mind at any given moment. It's what you're thinking about. And what we know about working memory is it has a very, very tiny capacity. You can only fit about 2 to 4 elements of information in your conscious mind at any given moment. And then the other form of memory is what we refer to when we refer to memory, which is our long-term memory. And this has an enormous capacity. In fact, nobody's ever filled up the long-term memory. Nobody's ever said, that's it, can't remember anything anymore, it's full. So it's incredibly expansive, incredibly large. And the key to deep thinking is being able to take the information that's coming into your mind from what you're learning, the conversations you're having, what you're reading, this very, very small capacity of working memory, and transfer it to your long-term memory. That's a process.
So he's talking about deep learning, making those connections. And sometimes you learn some new information, you get primed to it, you get exposed to it, and it takes some time to really sink in and make connections throughout the brain. So for it to permeate across the connections, the understanding to really permeate means that these neurons have to make those connections with everything else that you might be thinking of. So you might pause, think about something that happened in the past, and think about something that could happen in the future. Think about some things that could that might be happening around you, or that you might have heard of, or whatever. Take that information and then see if what you've learned today, for example, and see if it matches with, or if there has something similar, in the other thing that you're thinking about. So then your brain is going to make that connection. And so sometimes it takes a long time, or sometimes it can be let me rephrase that. This process of deeper understanding of things, for example, does take some time. And the more the scholars mention in Islam, for example, that when you learn Islam, when you get the knowledge, it takes some time for it to actually kind of go across the board in your brain. And so it takes time to really understand certain the things that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has revealed. So it makes sense for us to therefore kind of default to the understanding of those that have grown up in Islam and they have learned Islam and they have been doing this from childhood essentially, because they probably have a deeper understanding of things as opposed to what you might call superficial learning. And they're going to mention superficial in any other video, but let's continue from here when he's talking about deep learning.
It's called memory consolidation. And it's only during memory consolidation that you connect that new piece of information to everything else you've learned and thought and experienced in your life. And it turns out knowledge isn't about these fragments of information that we can pick up all the time today. It's about the connections and associations that we make inside our own brains among all the pieces of information we gather. It's only when you make those connections that you get rich thinking, rich knowledge. Maybe if you're lucky, you even end up with some wisdom. The problem is that there is a break. It's very easy to break this consolidation process. Because you have such a small capacity in your conscious mind, if you're overloaded with information, nothing stays there very, very long. Because in order to take in that new tweet or notification or Facebook update or Google result, you have to clear out something that's already in your conscious mind. And what we know about the consolidation process is it only happens when we're attentive. Only happens when we concentrate for some period of time on new information. It's attention that triggers the transfer of information to our long-term memory and allows us to create.
So he mentioned the word wisdom, and I want you to think about the meaning of the word wisdom. What does wisdom actually mean? But let's continue.
For some period of time on new information. It's attention that triggers the transfer of information to our long-term memory and allows us to create all of these connections. And what we've created for ourselves with this rich, vibrant digital environment is a constant source of disruption, interruption, distraction. That means we're never keeping information long enough in our attention to form these rich connections. And
So I'm going to pause here. I know the ads that came up were pretty much the antithesis of all this stuff he's talking about. So let's sit down for a second and just kind of make the connections that we need to make. So just use the opportunity over here for us to connect all the things that he's talked about, the previous speaker talked about, and make connections to the challenge activity, the check-in questions, the things that we've covered so far in terms of neuroplasticity, in terms of how the framing works and how perceptions work, and the difference between capital T truth and lowercase t truths that are our own perceptions that may not align with the capital T truths, and the importance of that in terms of conflicts and in terms of conflict management, in terms of de-escalation, in terms of crisis management, and different things like that. So just understanding that, kind of looking at different things that we could consider as we move forward. So how can this information that we've learned today kind of spread out to different categories of information that we have, or different types of things that we think about normally, whether it's working with youth, whether it's working with the community members, whether it's social justice, whether it's whatever it is, right? How does this connect across the board? How does it impact us in our growing and learning on a constant basis? How does it help us in being mindful in terms of our purpose, in terms of making connections with people and how they can align towards our purpose and so on? How does this help us become better people? How does it increase us in compassion and so on? So make those connections. Take a minute to do that. I'm going to pause for a minute. And you guys just can make those connections. But really, like, if you need to close your eyes or whatever, you could do that, inshallah. Okay, that's a minute. And this is just to get you started. It was just a thought activity, and you guys can carry this on, obviously, as you go forward in life. This is just something to do. We paused for a minute because we were providing a lot of information, but maybe you didn't have a moment to reflect today, overall, but also I want to make sure that this is something that we can take an opportunity to do now.
This is more than just a theoretical concern. We see growing bodies of scientific evidence that show this happening. There was a very important study done a few years ago at Stanford in California, where the researchers gathered two groups of people. One people who spent a lot of time online, a lot of time multitasking, glancing from one message to another. They called these the heavy multitaskers. And another group of people that did much less of that, which they called the light multitaskers. They gave these two groups of people 6 standard basic tests of cognitive function. How deeply they thought, how well they thought. The heavy multitaskers did worse on all 6 of the tests. One of the tests was a test of multitasking skill itself. Heavy multitaskers did worse on the multitasking test. Although if you ask them, they say, oh, I'm great at multitasking, I do it all the time. What really happens is that they're burning up all their mental energy, switching from one thing to another. And if they just focus for a little while on one thing, they would perform much, much better. But to me, the most interesting, most revealing of these tests was one that examined how well people are able to distinguish important information from trivia. In here, the heavy multitaskers performed much worse than the light multitaskers. And what the scientists theorize, and I think this makes complete sense, is that the more time we spend jumping from bit of information to bit of information every couple of minutes during our day, the less we worry about how important something is, and the more we're simply attracted to whatever's new. So it's the new thing that grabs our attention. For instance, if it's a nice little cat video, you'll go to the cat video. You won't focus, even if you have something very important, very interesting in front of you. And so that's what we've created for ourselves, is this world in which, thanks to our technology, we're constantly subverting our ability to think our deepest, most profound thoughts. And there was another study done a couple of years ago in which a woman named Patricia Greenfield at the University of California, Los Angeles, went out and examined 50 different experiments that had been done over the years to see how different technologies, different media influence the way we think. What she concluded was that there is a benefit for all this time we spend online. We seem to have greater visual acuity. And what's meant by that is we can shift our focus more quickly among more images, more things on a screen than we were able to do before. But the trade-off here, what we lose in optimizing our brain for shifting our attention, is what she described as mindful knowledge acquisition, creative thinking, reflective thinking, critical thinking. Now, however much we might appreciate that we've optimized our brains to shift our focus very quickly, I think most of us would agree that those things, mindful knowledge acquisition, the ability to think critically and to think conceptually and deeply, those are really the fundamental aspects of the highest forms of human thinking. And essentially, by becoming slaves to our technology, we've cut ourselves off more and more from those highest forms of thinking. I can argue that as a society, we're starting to pretend that that doesn't matter. We've got to place all our focus on the speed with which we can gather new information.
Disney Plus.
So focus on to think about the words that you just mentioned here. Think about those concepts and what we're missing as a consequence of these things that we're really focused on otherwise, or that we're paying attention to, or we spend a lot of time with.
A very important part of being intelligent to gather new information, but it's only the first stage of using your mind in the fullest way possible. The second and more important stage is actually to cut yourself off, to screen yourself from all that incoming information, and consider deeply, think deeply about what you've discovered. And it's that second process, more important process, that is fading more and more away from us. And as I argue, as a society, we're kind of saying, oh, that doesn't matter. What matters is the speed of the consumption of information. So if there's one overarching danger that I think we face as individuals and as a society in our dependency on on our smartphones and our computers and the web, is that we're sacrificing our ability to determine for ourselves what our minds focus on, what we pay attention to. We're ceding that incredibly important function to the technology itself. And we know that Facebook and all these other companies are happy to take over that function for you, happy to determine what you look at. But it seems to me, if we sacrifice that fundamental quality of our mind, the ability to determine for ourselves what we're going to think about and how much time we're going to spend thinking about it, then for all the gains the internet has given us, we'll be sacrificing perhaps the most important thing that governs the depth of our thought. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So I bet now you're not so sure. Nicholas, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.
Okay, so now this is going to be a summary of what he just said. It's a little bit more visual, and it makes sense if it was like an overflow of information.
So you're reading an article online when you get an instant message with a link to a funny photo, which of course you have to share. And now you're reading your Facebook news wall, which sends you to a video of a panda bear attacking a kid. And now you're reading Wikipedia to learn everything you can about the violent behavior of panda bears. And this is what 3 minutes on the internet can be like. We live like this all the time, and it has to have some kind of effect on us.
The net is making us more superficial as thinkers.
That is Nicholas Carr. He is the author of The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. To understand this whole thing better, we need to go way back in time, to say, like, the prehistoric age.
You wanted to know everything going on around you, because the more you knew about your surroundings, the less likely you were to get attacked by a predator. And there's even evidence that our brains release some dopamine, pleasure-producing neurotransmitter chemical, to reward us for seeking out and finding new information.
So getting distracted felt good and helped us stay alive. But the problem is that nowadays, predators aren't much of an issue, but we still have the same brains. And also, there's the internet, which is...
It's an incredibly information-rich environment that the net creates for us, and that's why we use it so much. I mean, sounds, pictures, words, text. And what this tends to do is promote a sort of compulsive behavior in which we're constantly checking our smartphone, constantly glancing at our email inbox. We're kind of living in this perpetual state of distraction and interruption,
which is dangerous because
that mode of thinking crowds out the more contemplative, calmer modes of thinking.
and that focused, calm thinking is actually how we learn. It's a process called memory consolidation.
And that means the transfer of information from our short-term working memory to our long-term memory. And it's through moving information from your working memory to your long-term memory that you create connections between that information and everything else you know.
So you've got this awesome life-changing piece of information in your short-term memory, but then you hear that email ding and poof, there it goes. That email takes its place and you never get a chance to learn anything, all because of one distraction.
So attention is the key, and if we lose control of our attention or are constantly dividing our attention, then we don't really enjoy that consolidation process.
But I can hear it now. Someone out there is saying, what does learning matter if all the information in the world is just a Google search away? Well,
that is kind of shortchanging our intellects. If that's the way you're using your mind, just kind of searching very quickly and finding information and then forgetting it very quickly, you're never building knowledge. You're kind of thinking like a computer.
which means that our very humanity is at stake. And it would be a shame if we all got assimilated because, well, humanity is pretty neat.
I really believe that if you look at the great monuments of culture, they come from people who are able to pay attention, who control their mind. That's what allows us to think in the highest terms, and think conceptually, think critically, think in some very creative ways.
And it's this kind of thinking that's at risk, being eroded one cute cat video at a time. Don't get us wrong, the internet is good for lots of things, and it should be celebrated. But the best thing we can do for our minds is to find some time every day to unplug, calm down, and focus on one thing at a time. Your email and those cats will be here when you get back.
Alright. So with that, we come to this. But before I do that, I hope the exposure to this information will help you when you actually sit down every single day to really just connect things together, really just be mindful of the stuff you've learned. There are questions that people ask, how do I have stronger memory? How do I learn this? Or how do I do this? But a lot of it has to do with just this understanding over here, that how much time are we spending really reflecting on the things that we've learned? How much time are we spending in terms of making those connections between what we've learned and the stuff that happened in our past and trying to resolve conflicts like that. Our brains work by, when it comes to riddles, for example, and I think we did this before, we have, and I explained that in the challenge activity, there's these little gaps that kind of come in, right, in two pieces of information, the beginning and the end, right? In this case, there is a situation where, for example, when we come here, there's some scenario that I presented, and I said what is going on and what do you do. Now, obviously there was an implication here, and you might have followed along with this implication or assumption that there is something that you could do. So your brain has this information, the beginning scenario, and you have this end assumption or this implication that something can be done over here to resolve this conflict. And so now there is a gap in the middle. This is fill in the blank. Now here's what your brain is trying to do is fill something in to actually make the connection from A to Z, right? Pretty much from point A to point B, in other words. So this is the connection that we're talking about. And when we come over here, for example, notice that we mentioned over here point A and point B, and we said there's a process that you can go through, right? So in this case, for example, in the challenge question, there is this end thing that you're thinking about. There is this resolution that should happen, and this is the framework that you're coming in with, for example. And the current situation is this scenario right here. And so now we're trying to focus on how is it that we're going to actually move from point A to point B in the most effective way. What are strategies that we can use? What are things that are going to help resolve this and help us understand what's going on and how to therefore address it? And I mentioned that these things that I show you over here might have some answers, but also some other things that we're doing in this intellectual stimulation is also helping in this regard. So I hope this is going to give you some tools and strategies and tips to understand, number one, how the brain works, and number two, how you can utilize that for your benefit in terms of any conflict, any situation, any challenge that you come across, and to actually be able to thereby thrive. So with that, is there anything that you have in mind that you would like to break down? And if you say that you need more time to process all the information, that's okay. That's actually good, because this is time for you. You could do that as well. If you had this information before, or if you knew this before, or just a review, then we can continue moving forward by breaking something down into pieces, understanding how things work. If not, we can pause here and go back to the challenge activity. So whatever you would like to do, inshallah. So you can mention something in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself. And as you're going through this, just keep one thing in mind, that when it comes to learning, and when we look back at the people who we consider as geniuses in their time, they didn't have this kind of distraction. They didn't have this kind of information that they were being distracted by all the time. Instead, they had time to reflect, and they had time to really sit down, and they had this appreciation for information because they actually had to put a lot of effort into it. And so that piece of information may have been so difficult to acquire that they really valued it, and they really thought about the implications and how much we can extract from that little piece of information in terms of everything else that we might be trying to figure out. So this is where also questions come in. Ibn al-Qayyim mentions that part of learning deen is also to know how to ask questions. So one part of learning is to understand how to ask questions, or what kind of questions are going to be effective questions. In other words, there are some good questions, and there are some questions that are not as good, if not bad. So that's something to keep in mind. And another note over here, another connection over here, Imam al-Bukhari, and this is like the early part of the Islamic Ummah. So in the first 200 to 300 years of the Muslim Ummah, a lot of the sciences were actually they were explored in a deeper sense, essentially, and there were frameworks that were finalized essentially and passed on, right? This is happening all in the first 200 to 300 years of Islamic history. All this information is being consolidated. All these frameworks are being finalized essentially, and they're being disseminated. There's all this discussion that goes on in terms of how we can make this information, and what kind of frameworks we can use, and kind of like really set on that accounts for different perspectives, different backgrounds, different experiences that human beings come with across the world, across time, and so on. And so these frameworks are therefore very, very very powerful in that sense, that they were just moving forward until today, and moving on into the future. They're still as useful and beneficial, if not more, than they were in the time when they were actually being finalized like that. And so something to keep in mind in that sense. So Imam Bukhari in that time period comes in, and he comes in with Sahih Bukhari. Now Sahih Bukhari is really interesting, and it is one of the higher levels of hadith text. If you want to actually explore his understanding and like actually navigate it, it is one of the higher levels of hadith text. And a lot of the early students of hadith, for example, might go into Arba'un Nawawi, for example, the 40 Imam Nawawi, or they might go through Jami' al-Tirmidhi, for example, and kind of understand the introduction of how hadith scholars put together some of the things and stuff, and what were they doing, and how they're organizing information in their books and so on, right? But when you get to Imam al-Bukhari, and he is actually the teacher of many of these hadith scholars in terms of the books that have reached us today, and the way he did it is really fascinating. And he put together this hadith collection, which is where the hadith, the chapter titles, for example, are his opinion or his discussion or his thought about something, or just kind of like reflections or something. Like it might be like, for example, what information exists that's valuable and that's the most authentic out of all the pieces that were there on a particular topic, right? What is the discussion among the fuqaha, for example, among the scholars and so on. And so he puts that as a chapter title, right? And then he gives you a hadith that are backing them up. In other words, before the medieval times and so on, right? Before all that, Islamic scholarship was so rich that this person is actually writing his entire book like you write essays today. You come up with, you have like an introduction introductory sentence, for example, or like a claim that you have or something, and then you back it up with certain evidences afterwards. So Imam Bukhari has consolidated his entire book like that in this framework. So you have the hadith that he said, the chapter title, for example, he has something that connects to it, some introduction to the topic and stuff like that. And then his hadith in that topic, in that section, are going to be all of the proofs that he has. Now, the interesting thing is that a lot of these hadith, you're going to be so confused in terms of like, how did he make that connection? So Imam Ibn Hajar, he wrote his huge, like ginormous compilation. And just the writing of this, not including the introduction, that took him about, I think one of them said 16 years just to write that, just to understand how the framework of Imam Bukhari worked and stuff. And then after that, he spent an actual 16 years of putting the information, like actually using that framework to then put commentary on Imam Bukhari's Sahih Bukhari. And that is a huge book, not a book, sorry, it's a multi-volume book, or a collection, I'll say, a compendium. And he consolidates all these other hadith and all these other commentaries before him and all the other things that you could find on the topics of Bukhari, and he actually shows how Imam Bukhari's mind was working and how he was actually able to extract bits of information, or like these concepts from like little tiny parts of a hadith. And that's why his placement of each of the hadith that he puts in these topics, or in these sections, are actually perfectly valid in the sense that they are actually great pieces of evidences. And if you understood that framework, you understand why he put this hadith here, why he put this hadith here. Whereas before, at the superficial level, you're going to be so confused. What in the world was he thinking? And then when it comes to this, to this, it makes sense for these people, for people that had this time and reflection, this mindfulness, and they actually deliberately put time to really think about everything that they did. They were thinking about, why am I doing this? Why am I not doing this other thing? Instead, they were actually actively processing information and thinking about things as they were making decisions. It wasn't just arbitrary stuff. It wasn't that they're brushing their teeth and not thinking about brushing their teeth, or why are they holding their brush this way, or whatever and stuff, right? And they weren't actually just kind of being automated, essentially. They tried to be as deliberate in everything that they do. And so that's why they were able to make those deeper connections that we sort of miss most of the time because of how we navigate our circumstances. And so Imam Bukhari, his Sahih Bukhari is then can be considered as one of the greatest pieces of art, essentially, if you want to call it that, right? And I don't know if it's going to come out in a certain way, but my definition is just like the art, this compilation, or this thing that he put together. So with that in mind, so you could say that he had one of the greatest pieces of art, essentially, if you're talking about literary works also being considered in art, but also talking about, like, in terms of his style, in terms of how you organize information and so on, could be one of the greatest, the pieces of work throughout history, right? And this is, again, before Shakespeare, like many years, like maybe like 1,000 years before Shakespeare, right? Of course, I'm giving a very rough estimate, and but anyways, I hope this makes sense, that throughout history there are these people, and you can go back even to Socrates and Aristotle and so on, and you can think about like how they had this synthesis of information, this consolidation, this deep understanding of things and so on. So with that in mind, if you have anything, inshallah, we can go over that. Otherwise, we'll go back to the challenge activity. And I'm reading comment. As you guys are thinking, I'll read the comment. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, and a lot of times, if you actually go up north, for example, in some places like New York, New Jersey, everything is happening so fast that you don't actually have a chance to just sit down and be like, okay, let me take a breather and let me just connect what happened today. Everything happens so fast, and the thing is that you're caught in the middle of fast movement. So even though you got home, you're still thinking about the things that are happening then, fast moving, and then things that are going to be happening tomorrow that you have to actually prepare for mentally. And so you don't actually get a chance, even when you're coming home, to just really take a breather and just kind of figure out what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, because the environment is fast-paced. So when people move from there to, like, North Carolina, for example, or other places like that, they sort of are able to sort of just pause for a second, and they can appreciate things and stuff in a certain way that maybe other people may not be able to. And so you compare life in a village, for example, or in these suburbs, for example, versus in the urban areas or in the more like the metropolitan areas where the bigger, like fast-paced stuff is going on. So just some reflections over here in how that's how that has given us certain ways to navigate our context, and how living in a particular environment without mindfulness can actually have a negative impact on us in a very fundamental way. And so you can understand how compassion can be lost. You can understand how empathy can be lost, and in these kinds of environments, and how then you can deliberately include these in your daily whatever you do, daily dealings and affairs and so on. And now there's this thing, actually it's been a recent trend, relatively recent trend, in terms of, for example, the Fortune 500 companies and the higher ones, the better companies, why they are like that, the criteria that they're using nowadays to determine best places to work, for example, why are they like that? What are they doing differently, right? For example, why is Google's headquarters, or like, their work, their buildings, why are they designed the way they are, for example? So they're using that because they want to make sure that people are actually able to make connections, that they're actually able to be happy in these environments and so on. They find meaning and purpose in their life and so on. They're not just like treated as robots, as factory workers were in the past and so on. And there is this thing about the philosophy of education of the past, and in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s and also the early 1900s, there was this discussion of what is the purpose of education? How do we define the word education? How do we define the word knowledge and learning and so on, right? These words of knowledge and learning and so on. How do we define them? And as a consequence of that, what kind of things should we teach in school? And that's why you'll see throughout time, and you should understand this as a necessary, as somewhat of a necessary necessity, where these kinds of things are going to continue to be updated. So Common Core was instituted and threw people off because they sort of assumed that these things don't need to change anymore. But just before that, in the early 1900s and before that, the things that were being taught, right, were different because they had, they were still trying to test the environment. They're trying to figure out what's going on, the dynamics of the world they were trying to match and so on. And so now, because of the rise of globalization, or the trend of globalization and internationalism and so on, you're going to see that there is a little bit more of focus on global communication, global understanding, things that weren't necessarily as big not too long ago. And so that's something to keep in mind now. All right, so with that in mind, again, let's go over here and the scenario. Does anybody have any thoughts on this scenario?
My first thought was that someone wasn't being honest.
Cool. Honesty implies that somebody wasn't being honest, may imply that the person was deliberately lying. It was ill-intended.
Wait, that last thing you said, your microphone was out.
Something like maybe like ill intent or something like that. Is that what you're saying? That the person, one of the people, is lying?
I mean, I don't know if I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but that was just my first thought, just because it's like contradicting stories.
Oh,
I was thinking that there could be some cultural differences. Like in one family, the way they speak to each other is much different than, let's say, the other family speaks to each other. So they may not think that they're being a certain way when it's being perceived as negative from the other side.
The word you used over here is perception. So there is a difference in terms of the narrative, right? But now we might be able to attribute it to a difference in perception. And this is the small t truth versus the capital T truth. So how do you deal with them? How do you interact with them? Because both are saying something different. And obviously when they have this conversation with each other, one person is going to be saying something, the other one is going to be saying something that's completely opposite. And so both sides might think the other person is just intentionally either lying, or maybe they are just too silly or too, I don't want to use this word, but let's say not in smart. They're not really smart or something like that, right? Let's say that this is the word. I can't think of another word. Maybe they're thinking that this person's mental capacity is not at a certain level, and that could be one option, or it could be that they're lying, right? So because they know that this person is mental capacity is not low, as in relative to what this information should require, then they're thinking that, well, the other option is because they're not, but because they are smart, they should know better. So maybe they're actually deliberately telling a lie. So these are the two possibilities that the brain might fill in the gap with. Why is this person saying something different than what happened from my perception, right? And so either you could say the blank can be filled with, okay, well, he doesn't know any better. He like he doesn't know anything, right? Like he's not able to mentally connect the dots or whatever and stuff, right? Or he's lying. So because he is able to mentally see this stuff, because I saw this and I felt this, therefore he must be lying. You see the situation? So they had two scenarios. So how would you respond to these two scenarios? Like two different possibilities, like either mental capacity is low, or number two, that this person is lying. And so because the mental capacity is not low from this person's perspective, relative, about the other person, then therefore it must be that the other person is lying.
First, I would want to ask more questions and get specific examples, very specific examples of what they're accusing each other's families of doing and stuff. And yeah, that would be the first step.
Let's say it's a bunch of the same thing, just both sides disagreeing on what happened and why it happened or whatever.
So I asked them more details, and they continue to deny what each person is saying. If one person is saying something straightforward and the other person denies it, and then the other person is saying something straightforward and the other person denies it, then that would lead me to believe there's lying.
I hesitated a little bit, but yeah, you're going to assume that there's lying, huh? Is there any other possibility that could be? Because that's what each of the sides is thinking as well, that one of them is lying.
I would want to take something that hasn't already happened and maybe try to do some, I want to say role playing. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but, try to work on how they're speaking with each other, or trying to say okay, if this, let's give them a scenario and then see what their reaction is to a scenario, but not something that happened in the past.
So let's say that they are still gonna disagree. Let's say that you did that, and then they are, they say, well, no, that's that you always do this and stuff, and you're not gonna do this and stuff, right? And another person says, well, no, you always do this and stuff, and I always try to do this and stuff, and then it becomes an escalated situation. So either the person's mental or their intellectual capacity is not so high that they can understand the situation, or number two, that they are lying. Question is, how do you respond to these two possibilities? If somebody if the either side mentioned these two possibilities and they said, okay, well, one of the possibilities I can refute by saying, no, this person is actually not intellectually unable to process this and the reality or whatever. So therefore this must be lying going on, because hey, the facts, this is what happened and stuff. And then the other person thinks the same way. So how do you address this?
If I came to the conclusion based on all the facts that someone was lying, and I guess if I knew who it was, I would talk to that person and focus on them and try to get to the bottom of things by asking them more questions.
I'm gonna reframe this for you guys to make it more interesting. It's the same thing, but I just rephrase it. There you go. This is a riddle. What's the answer to this riddle? Notice like we use the keyword possibilities. And I mentioned how the brain fills in the gap. You know the beginning, and you know that there should be a right answer, an objective reality. So your brain is trying to fill in the gap. And hey, intellectual capacity is not likely the scenario here, so the other possibility of deliberate manipulation or lying might be the other option that the brain can test out with, and hey, that this could be working out. What else could fill in the gap? Notice I mentioned two possibilities. I've never said that those are the only two possibilities that could happen. And this is the key for conflict resolution. If you didn't know, a lot of times this is one of the most powerful ways that you can actually resolve conflict, be it and de-escalate situations.
I mean, I still think that there's the possibility that they're just misunderstanding each other's intentions.
Yes. Perception, right? Perception, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
If I give somebody roses without realizing that they're allergic to them, my intention is an act of love, but they are thinking that I'm trying to harm them.
What happens if you do that repeatedly and they repeated it like that, but you tried maybe like you said, maybe it was this person was allergic, and so you figured it out eventually. So the next time you gave them something else, but they still didn't like that, and then you tried a third time something different because you said, okay, the first two didn't work out. Maybe this person was allergic. Maybe they didn't like this. Maybe like maybe I did it for my whatever. Let me try the third option, right? So then the third time they did the same thing, fourth time they did the same thing, fifth time they kept on doing the same thing over and over again. That's what the scenario is about. The first time it makes sense, right? It could be this misunderstanding. What about the 50 times that they've tried, or maybe like the last 3-4 years that they tried this?
Well, the person who continues trying to give gifts that are unappreciated has failed to learn that that is not that other person's love language. And the one who's receiving ungratefully has failed to try to be the gracious receiver.
That could be a possibility, yes. It could definitely be a possibility. How would you figure out if that's the possibility? And how would you know that the other possibilities beyond these 3 or 4 possibilities didn't work or wouldn't work to fill in this gap, this blank? Okay, so these are things I would let you think about deeper. One of the things I realized when I was working a case that was, something like this, is that both sides had expectations about each other, or both sides had stuff that they were bringing in that did not match the reality of things. So it had to do with perceptions, definitely. One side, in this particular case, understood the interaction of the spouse from their backstory, essentially. Pretty much what they had learned, the way they grew up and stuff, the way they were doing things and stuff, and then they sort of assumed, they took for granted that the other person is going to look at the world the same way. And so they were being honest, they were being as nice as possible, they were doing all these things and stuff, right? But from the other perspective, the other person had started, in fact, the first one too, a little bit, but the second one especially, they grew up in an environment where there was some toxicity in the family, and things were like the person wasn't being appreciated. They were being personally attacked for things that were actions and not personal attributes and stuff, right? For example, the person might make a mistake, right? And instead of saying that the person made that mistake, instead of focusing on the mistake itself, the chastisement, for example, or whatever what was said, right, was actually directed towards the person, as if the person was had a evil intent, or the person was inherently a bad person, the person was inherently stupid or dumb or whatever and stuff, right? So it attacked the person as opposed to focusing on the action itself, right? So the person eventually, over time, started personalizing these things, and they actually started believing that they themselves are, in fact, this worthless person, this nothing person or whatever, right? So now they come into this environment where a person is doing all these things for them, and they are not able to keep up with how much they're doing, like the other person is doing for them, right? They're not, and then any failures that they make, they find themselves doing, right? Any failures in their life, essentially, failures in terms of like, they make a mistake, essentially. That's what I mean. So in this case, when they're doing this, they feel so bad about themselves because they're like, here we go again. Here, look, my negative stuff is coming out, and the other person is eventually going to figure out I'm just a worthless person that they shouldn't be doing all these things for, and I am the person that is therefore the conflict in this marriage, and so therefore I don't want to be part of this marriage because now the other person seems to have figured it out. Now the person actually starting to say the same thing that I was always hearing, and you know what? I think that I am really, in fact, a hopeless person, that I just like need to be away from people and stuff. So the issue was the frameworks that both of them were using for the other person didn't actually align with the realities of those people, right? And there was this misunderstanding, as you were saying, and through the repeated efforts of like trying, it wasn't that they were not understanding each other's, that they were failing to appreciate the love language, or like even like addressing the love language, or and so like whatever it was, right? It was just that they were actually not even targeting the root issue. The love languages were the surface things, right? They're surface things, but ultimately deep down inside, the conflict that the person had brought, or the conflict that was inside themselves that they brought into the marriage, was actually the root issue over here. As soon as we address that fundamental root cause, then we're going to be able to be idnillah, help them actually like see that love language that they had, or like the thing that the other person was doing for them was actually good, and the person would actually appreciate that thing, right? And they'll be like, you know what, I always liked that this person actually gave me gifts and stuff, and like that is my love language, but I just had this underlying thing that was that kept on distracting me. Remember that the brain is always looking for solutions for previous problems and stuff, and that's what we define as baggage. When there's a matter in place that you have and you deal with, and it doesn't make sense, or it's overwhelming, or whatever, and so on. And so what happens is you fill in the gap, right? So in this case, when like let's say your family member, your parents, or whatever, they curse you, for example, and they whatever, right? And so or they say that you're just like, you're just a failure in life or whatever. And so because you broke a glass or something like that, right? And then as a consequence, if it happens repeatedly over time, you start actually trying to fill in the gap, right? And so you actually eventually, after ruling out everything, right, you actually start filling the gap with, I am this person that my parents are saying. Why else would they say something like that? And hey, I did make this mistake. I could have done things differently and stuff, right? So you know what? I am a failure in life. That is how they feel. And mental health, a lot of mental health can have this direct, thing, where this is the underlying thing because of toxicity in families, and among peers, and in terms of like multiple places in society as well, right? When there's mocking, when there's like roasting somebody, for example, when there's like insulting, whether it's like demeaning, whether it's picking on somebody, whether it's like name calling, for example, whether it's the political ads that go on and the other person is being demonized and stuff, right? These are toxic behaviors. I mean, these are happening at the highest level, whether we want to admit them or not. It's happening, right? And somebody might come in and say, well, you should just suck it up and just keep going with it as if it's not meant to do anything. But that's not really how this works in life, right? These might seem as like like trivial matters and stuff, but these fundamentally in place in the other person's heart and mind, that this person is actually the person being described. I was actually my sister was mentioning a story yesterday, where she mentioned about somebody who was working in a particular scenario and was doing like a major like relief effort kind of thing, I believe in Syria or something like that. And then there were some political sort of stuff that was being mentioned about him, lies about his organization, essentially, that he was like people, like they were misappropriating funds for their own personal benefit and so on and so on. So one day they found his body, like he had jumped off like out of his building or whatever into the, and just committed suicide essentially. And so there was a lot of rumors and stuff, and there was a private auditor, or like sorry, like there was an audit done on his organization, and they actually realized that there was none of that stuff was true. But because these governments and these other people and stuff that were actually perpetuating these things, including in social media, because started spreading like wildfire on social media that he's doing this, whatever his organization is doing, his wife is doing this, whatever. And so at the end, it became so overwhelming that the person took his own life, so committed suicide. So when we live in toxic societies, and this is a very important thing over here, then these things become the byproducts of that kind of environment. So despite what we might consider as, higher literacy rates, for example, or despite advancements in technology and so on, if for fundamental core things that actually core components of societies, meaning human beings, are not addressed and they're not taken care of, it doesn't matter how much money we make, what the GDP is for a country. It doesn't matter what kind of literacy rate we have and stuff. Right? Ultimately, this society is doomed for failure, and that's the end of that. Right? So, and until we address these fundamental issues in our personal lives, until we address them in our masajid, in our communities, in our organizations, in our companies, in our governments, in our societies at large, we will be heading towards this destruction for ourselves. And this is something that's to keep in mind over here. Over here, the framework was the people. There was misunderstanding in terms of the other person was actually coming in with some mental health concerns, and this person had a lot of baggage in their life because they were actually personalizing. Remember, we talked about personalization in previous thing, one of the previous lectures. We were talking about personalization, right? People who become pessimistic or optimistic. I don't know if you remember those conversations, but we talked about personalization. This personalization happens when a person actually believes that they are the causes of the stuff that's happening. Like they are fundamentally bad, or failures in life, right? And so when they come in with this mindset, they're going to come in and they're going to start feeling like any comment that was made, any mistake that they made, like it's something that makes them actually be a bad person. Not just they made a mistake, okay, let's learn from the mistake and move on. They are fundamentally that, right? And this can also be a fixed mindset scenario, right? As opposed to a growth mindset. So as soon as this person realizes this, it's going to have a huge, huge impact in terms of changing their framework and saying, wait a minute, I made a mistake, that's what happened. Now, the person who might actually be perpetuating this in families, for example, if you go to Egypt, if you go to Pakistan, if you go to other places, in the world, you're going to find that a lot of people, a lot of cultures are very toxic cultures. People are just on their edges all the time. If you find a culture where people are insulting and mocking each other, just understand that these are insecurities. In fact, as you saw in the recent political ads that were going on, and people even in North Carolina, for example, when people were just going at each other in terms of how this person is a really bad person, a really bad politician, and things like that, these are intended to not actually focus on the actual facts of or like the platform of the person that they're addressing. They hit directly the person themselves, right? And this is an intellect in logic. This is a fallacy, and there's stages of these like fallacies. At the very top, you're trying to actually address the issues as they are. You're trying to address the issue, the logic itself, right? But then when you fail to do that, then you try to go to a level. And so one of the levels is when you actually try to target the person himself, right? And so you character assassinate the person. It has nothing to do with the logic, like the person or any of his points. It just has to do with focusing on the person himself. So if you can make a person look bad, as in fundamentally inside they're a bad person, right? Then you don't have to worry about anything that they say. That's you can see why that's a fallacy, because that has nothing to do with the things that are being said. It doesn't have anything to do with the impact of his words might have on people, but rather at least in terms of policies that are made and so on, right? But it does easily get a person out of the picture. So these are things that we need to be mindful of, and we do this all the time. We don't oftentimes recognize this. In families, this is one of the biggest things, because if families are the foundation of society, then it is important for us to understand that these are the things that we need to focus on first. If parents do not know how to parent, then the parents are the part of the problem over here. They are part of the problem, and they're not helping their kids. If siblings don't understand how to navigate this context among themselves, then they are part of the problem, right? And if extended families, relatives, and so on don't understand the dynamics that happen between families and so on, then they are part of the problem. And unless we accept this, right, from a growth mindset. I'm not saying from a fixed mindset, because if you accept it from a fixed mindset, you're gonna just say, okay, well, this is a negative thing and stuff, and you know what? How is this going to help us actually move forward and stuff, right? But no, I'm talking about accepting it from a growth mindset. You accept it, say, okay, this is the reality, and we would like to go to this other, this future vision, and then here's where we stand. We go towards it by taking realistic steps, and we move forward, and we're going to be able to be able to slowly, step by step, one at a time, get these things out of our societies. So in other words, a lot of these things, as hard as it is to accept overall, we are the reasons as a society why mental health is a big issue, why bullying in school and cyberbullying is a big issue, are big issues, why there's always this there's this animosity between cultures, for example, this xenophobia that people people have and stuff. We are the reasons for that because of our mindset, because of our fixed mindset, because of our unwillingness to accept the reality of things and stuff, right? Because of our being unrealistic about things, because of us not appreciating, just again, appreciating and understanding a different, another person's framework and their background doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with those things. It just means that you understand where they're coming from, and that starts us off in terms of communication. We understand what that means, and then we can move forward. If people have bad family dynamics, right, or they had bad history, right, meaning like traumatic history or whatever, and it was not resolved, they will bring that into a relationship, and that is going to negatively impact both sides. And that's one of the reasons I believe personally, and from an Islamic perspective, that this can have intergenerational impact. And as you know, there are studies done in the intergenerational nature of like divorces and like the negative family dynamics and so on. There's research on this, and maybe another time I can mention that, inshallah. But there's a lot of information. There's a lot of research that's been done, and I have I shared in somewhere else. I shared a bunch of links in terms of research that has actually been done on this right here over the past maybe like 30, 40, 50 years and stuff. They've actually figured out a lot of cycles that continue onwards in families and so on. So to break these cycles, we have to go to the root of the issue. And to conclude, inshallah, I think I mentioned this before, but I want to bring this back. So for one of my engineering senior designs, one of the classes that I had, this is the teacher, first day of class, he gave us a picture of a machine, and pretty much the information that I get given is that the people over here in this company or whatever it is, they're saying that this machine is shaking violently, like it's moving a lot more than it's supposed to, and it's making a lot of noise as well, right? And that's it. So you know that this is what's happening, and now you have to go in and try to figure out, number one, based on certain parameters. For example, you have time constraint, you have budget constraint, you have like maybe in the manpower restraints, maybe you have all these, or maybe you have technology constraints, maybe whatever, right? All of these constraints accounted for, and thereby then come up with a solution. In other words, you have to figure out what are the things that you need to look at, what are the most important and relevant pieces of information that are going to help you in terms of identifying what the problem is, and then what are the most effective ways to actually address them. Now, today, there's a lot of data being mined and farmed and being collected and so on. And what the big companies are doing now is they're taking that information, instead of looking at it as just a bunch of data, they're actually trying to sift through what's most relevant for their purposes. So they're just not just taking all this information and that's it. They're actually trying to find information that could be useful. So this is about being deliberate and purposeful, meaning you have a purpose in mind, you have a reason, you know exactly what you're looking for from all of this chaos, right? All of this bunch of information that's out there. You go, you know exactly where to look for, you know what to look for, and you pull it out. And that's it. You leave everything far behind. And this is going back to the connection with the internet that he was talking about, and also being mindful and so on, and not getting overwhelmed and frustrated and annoyed and stuff. And so I hope this is helping us understand in terms of why the struggles and challenges can actually lead towards growth. In fact, they can actually precipitate growth and actually help us become better people. So with that, inshallah, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this and let you mention anything that you have in terms of check-ins. And if not, then we will go ahead and conclude, inshallah.